you are only approaching the spiritual life when you have come away from such ideas as self-preservation or let the buyer beware, and all of these other things that you know about. Now, the materialistic state of consciousness has been imposed upon us by universal belief. We didn't choose to be materialistic. It was, at birth, we could have been anything. But because we were born into a materialistic age, we took on the complexion of materialistic consciousness. Now, through spiritual studies, we are breaking through those limitations. Now let me show you again. All disease, all sin, all fear, and death itself, all of these are imposed upon us. None of these have rise in you. The failure in psychology and psychiatry, and perhaps some of you may have read in today's paper that psychiatry is now beginning to acknowledge that its entire basis is erroneous, and that it must look now for different principles through which to function. Of course, it has been a failure. Psychology has been a failure because the premise is wrong, and the reason that the New Thought movement, in all of its phases, has decreased to the extent that it has in the last 30 years is due to the fact that its basic premise is erroneous. Its basic premise is that the error, whatever its name or nature, has its rise in you. And therefore, we must find out what your particular error is and remove it. Now, this never was true. It isn't true now, and it never will be. All error has its basis in the universal belief, and this universal belief had its beginning in the acceptance of two powers. You are no more responsible for the particular ill that bothers you than Jesus Christ is responsible for it. You are as guiltless as he. You are as guiltless of the sin that besets you as any spiritual master. The fault is not yours. It does not have its rise in you. There is no such thing as you being unloving, or you being sensual, or you being unjust. There is no such thing. And every type of healing that is based on uncovering the error in the patient must fail. Some few temporary successes are due to reasons other than the use of such principles, just as many healings that take place in all of the metaphysical movements do not take place because of the principles through which the practitioner is working, but rather because of the consciousness of the practitioner, which is often far greater than the knowledge of principles. I can explain that this way. It would make no difference if you were studying principles that were not correct. There are in existence quite a few books on metaphysics that are as incorrect as 2 times 2 is 17. And yet there are people studying those and healing. They are doing the healing in spite of the error of their teaching. In other words, their own individual spiritual integrity is doing the healing work, not that mass of misinformation that they are absorbing. So it is that there are healers in every one of the metaphysical movements who are far greater than the teachings that they are following. And this must always be. It must always be, because healings are not brought about by the principles, but by the consciousness of the individual practitioner. Now, in every teaching there is truth, and enough truth so that the practitioner of spiritual integrity finds those gems of truth and with them develops spiritual consciousness. An illustration in point. There was a sailor back during the war who was on leave in New York, and suddenly, and out of a clear sky, became ill and felt that he couldn't make it back to his ship. And so he stopped into the nearest hotel, which was a very cheap place down near the wharfs, and got a room, went up to bed. But he was making no headway in getting out of this illness. He was a Christian Scientist. He telephoned downstairs to the clerk and asked if there were any books on Christian Science available. The clerk looked around and finally came back and said, yes, he found a life of Mrs. Eddy. Well, the young man asked to have it sent up to him. And when it came up, it was one of those lives that vilify Mrs. Eddy. It was one of those vicious books that have been written that are filled with, you might call it, metaphysical pornography. And as this young man began to read, he discerned the nature of the book he was reading and thought, well, there's not going to be much healing in this book. And then he noticed that on almost every page there was a quotation from Mrs. Eddy's writings. And so, taking pencil and paper, he copied down the quotations and threw the rest of the book away, and by morning had healed himself and was able to get back to his ship. So there is nothing so evil in which some good cannot be found. And so it is, there is nothing so erroneous that there isn't enough good in it for those who are looking for good. And therefore, do not give all of the credit to our teachings for the spiritual advancement of individuals, remembering that the greater part of their development comes not from the teaching, but from their own inner integrity, which somehow utilizes the teaching to its end.